Hello and welcome to today's SEI webcast, Elements of Effective Communications for Cybersecurity Teams. My name is Shane McGraw, Outreach Team Lead here at the Software Engineering Institute, and I'd like to thank you for attending. Our featured speaker today is Dr. Sharon Mudd. Dr. Mudd is a Senior Cybersecurity Operations Researcher in the CSIRT Division here at the Software Engineering Institute. In this role, Sharon helps international teams build security operations and incident management capabilities, mentors individuals, and builds skills for a broad range of cybersecurity roles to foster development of maturity for security incident response and security operations teams. Her career spans over 30 years in IT and information security roles, focusing on information security governance, risk management, compliance, and assurance. Now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Sharon Mudd. Sharon, good afternoon, all yours.
Thank you, Shane. I appreciate it. That was a very nice intro. I don't even know what to say. It always sounds weird hearing about myself from someone else. So today, as Shane mentioned, we're going to talk about a key element that cyber teams and incident management teams need to understand and need to have, but don't always either want to or understand the nuance of. So we're going to talk about how to build some effective communications for your team and why that's an important need for you. I always like to start by telling people that, as you heard in my background there was no communications degree, there was no formal training in that field. That's not my background, but given the kinds of work that I've done over the span of my career and being in that urgent need of telling people what's going on, we've kind of learned under fire a little bit. And so did the team that helped put this presentation together. I will also note that this presentation was built really to highlight a paper that our team wrote in 2021. It's called Guide to Effective Communications. And that will be linked at the end of the presentation, and you'll be able to see where that is. So what we're going to do today is we're going to cover kind of the wide and narrow view of why incident management teams or security operations teams may need to figure out what to do from a communication perspective. If you've been in the midst of an incident, you may feel very stressed. You may feel very demanded of when people are asking you what's going on, and you don't always have maybe the tools you need to tell them what's going on while still doing the response activities that you're doing. So that's what we're going to cover. Some of this, we'll talk about how to plan for that ahead of time, what teams can put together to help them not be so stressed during those times, what kinds of communications are important or have been found to be good to have prepared, what kind of mechanisms you might use to put those communications out to the audience that you want to put them out to. And then just the overall process of the reasons why and how you can manage communications with your constituents, and those are the people who you offer services to the general public, and even to a media outlet. So, like I said, this is a high level, and there's definitely more depth and some nice checklist type information in the paper that I've mentioned. Okay, here's our agenda for today. We'll look at the planning process, as I said. We'll look at the responsibilities for communication within the incident management lifecycle. We'll look through how those responsibilities and how that planning may get altered or changed a little bit if it's a crisis situation, which is always heightened urgency. And then we'll look at some of those communication resources that I mentioned. One of the things that helps a team build success, sustainability, is their ability to provide information to people that they need either help from or that they need to supply information to help them. And that's also regular, normal operations when nothing's going wrong, and especially important at those times when there's a really big incident or there's a really big crisis of some kind. Some of that that need kind of is driven by a number of things. The highlighted thing at the bottom of the screen here is the kind of the summary, right? If you're planning and you're managing all of your communications properly, that helps influence your team's ability to maintain trust with all of the people that you share information with or that you talk to, including the general public, including media. It helps your team validate and build their reputation for being, trustworthy, right? And also, honest and transparent in how they talk to people. And it also gives you some effectiveness for your management services. If you're working on an incident, you can be more effective if those communications are two-way street. So that's why we think we need them, and we have been kind of proven, but have been in those roles, that those are important. So some of the scope that we're going to talk about today about a communication plan, right? Not everybody's going to have the same one. All right, there are some generalities, there are some template kinds of things you can look at, but all that said is you have to take that kind of information and tailor it to the culture of your organization to include whatever considerations you need for your internal, your external folks that you have to talk to. What your objectives are for the different kinds of communications that we'll mention. They may be a little bit different. If you're in a critical infrastructure organization, or if you are in a national organization, right, the objectives are going to be different. We'll talk a little bit about common areas where people share information, how to communicate in a crisis situation. Like I said, it's a little bit urgent, and people tend to get very angsty about that. And then what the differences are and why it's important to build both proactive and reactive communications. So when we're thinking of governance, and just governance is a broad term, meaning how you set up all of the rules and requirements in an organization, in a national team, in some kind of government agency, right? Governance is that thing that helps people understand what they're supposed to be doing. So that's what the environment where you have your connections, where your communications are important. And these are the kinds of things in the picture here that we're thinking of. What existing policies and processes do you have? What are the roles and responsibilities of the folks on your team and the ones that you deal with? Where do you get some of those external rules and requirements? That could be regulatory, that could be legislative. Who are you trying to serve, right? Which community are you trying to interact with? So those are the key factors that you're thinking through when we're talking about starting to think through how do you build messaging that you can provide the information that people need to have at a time when it's very important for them to have it as transparently as possible. Right? A lot of people, especially me from a technical security background, I tend to be a little bit close to the vest a little bit about how I want to talk to people. In this particular role, though, it's very important to be as transparent as you can so that people can build that trust and can have some sense that you are working at the best of your abilities and that you are providing them the information that is important to them. Okay. So from a planning perspective, general elements of how you start to think about planning communications, right? And these are the high level bullets of what you would want to include in a plan that you might label. Here's my communications plan for my team. What is the purpose of your plan? I just listed a number of things that you could use for that. So establishing a purpose, and that's just a statement, right? Why do we have this thing? What is our audience? And when you think through the audience, and we'll talk about them again momentarily, all of those internal, external, all of those other different kinds of folks you might be talking to. What's also good to define in that plan is what are the roles, what are the responsibilities? Meaning, who is allowed to do what, who is required to do what, and what are those things, and what am I responsible for? What are my stakeholders responsible for? All of those ins and outs are good to know up front. Understanding and standardizing the kinds of messaging that you use. And like I said before, it's not a cookie cutter approach, but there are some commonalities between those kinds of things. So if you develop a message, it may be a shell, it may be a format, it may be a template, and you can customize it at the time of delivery. But there should be some very easy to grab and put together messaging that you can send out for the various situations where you have them. Sometimes those are, which channels are we going to use? That's another thing to set up. Channels could be anything from social media to a video stream to a phone call, to an email. So which kind of messaging makes sense for which kind of channel? And that all depends on what kind of incident you're working on or what kind of messaging you're trying to get out there. Okay. So part of the plan implementation is not just putting it together, writing it down, checking it, done, and then putting it on the shelf, right? It's a continuous improvement situation. So once you have a plan, we'll talk a little bit about what the model is for, train people how to use it, test it. Like don't test it at the time of an incident, test it ahead of time. Do a tabletop exercise, get 2 or 3 key players that you might want to talk to, see how that goes. It's much less nerve-wracking if you are testing it in a situation that is not, meaning you have a huge outage that you need to deal with. Okay, review that, refine it as needed so that it lives continuously over time. Okay, so from a planning perspective, when you build an incident response plan, these inclusions are typically there. What reporting mechanisms are you going to use as part of an incident response? Now, this can be outside of incident response for just regular operational type needs. We already mentioned roles and responsibilities. This third bullet here I like the most, sharing information on a consistent basis. It means over time, people will understand and trust that you're going to share information with them. When these things happen, you're going to be regular about it, and you are just going to be constantly in the background of their lives if you are good at what you're doing. Not in a crisis situation necessarily, but overall, as you continue, that's how you build trust and get your name recognition with those stakeholders that need to trust you. And that's how you can provide that ability to coordinate with both your internal and your external stakeholders. Right? Some of that is just giving people information so that they are aware of what's happening. If there's a huge incident that's not affecting you, but is affecting some of your regional neighbors, maybe that's some good information to share. So, hey, we're seeing this. We don't see it here yet, but be aware that this may be, coming our way, helping people prepare for that kind of thing. So for the kinds of services that are listed here at the bottom, communications are very important for responding to an incident, for the recovery process, which means getting things back to good and operating successfully, for building awareness within the community that you're responsible for, and for providing any kind of training for your stakeholders, for your constituents, and for people in your organization that you need to make sure that that all goes well. So I mentioned responsibilities twice or 3 times. So let's talk about what that means. Especially, we're going to look at it in light of incident management, but this can transcend that narrow perspective as well. Communicating with stakeholders. So stakeholders are all of those people who have some, we'll call it skin in the game for how your incident process works, which means either they help guide you with directions from a management perspective. They are part of your constituent community, right? So they have a stake in what you're doing because it's important to them and it affects them. Some of the proactive kinds of communications that you can do with that community and with the general public are listed here. I mentioned general security awareness, right? You might get messaging every now and then that says, hey, there's a new vulnerability out for phones, whatever model phone. That may not be something that you're responsible for, but it's a nice awareness message to help people stay safe and keep their information, private. Advertising the services that you do offer to your constituency is a great thing to communicate. Hey, we're here to help you if you have a security incident, if you need help with this, if you need help with this kind of service, right? That way they know why they should call you and what it is they can expect from you. Often, especially from a regulation perspective, there may be some compliance type concerns or requirements. So if you take PCI, for example, which is the payment card industry requirements for security across an organization that processes credit cards, there are certain things you have to comply with or they won't let you use the network that they've built. And that is the major credit card companies who have put that together, was one example. Or there's some other examples in Energy, there are some energy requirements, right? All kinds of places you can get requirements from. And a lot of times those organizations, those regulators will ask you to attest to your compliance with the security mechanisms that they have required of you. Sometimes you get, like I mentioned before, some very widespread, very dangerous attacks. You want to communicate to people to make sure that they are prepped and ready, maybe for your next communication, if you do see it active on your networks. But in any event, you want to be that organization who helps people stay safe and stay secure. Okay. The second to the last bullet here, notification form mitigations. And mitigations are just ways you can protect systems that may be vulnerable or that may have already experienced some piece of an attack and need to get fixed and put back online. So these are how can I fix this and move forward? That's what mitigations are. And then, like I mentioned before, helping people just prevent, falling into a situation where they have, some exposure, either a network exposure or some kind of system exposure that would let data potentially get out of the organization. Excuse me. Communicating with the media. And my first response is always, I don't talk to the media, because that is not my background. That is not my training. I mentioned that earlier. I know that I don't have all the nuance for what makes that a good conversation. So I prefer not to, but I know it's important. So if you're looking for media communication, right, that's someone who can help you in the process of getting information out to a wider audience. It's also someone that may ask questions because they've heard a rumor about a situation, right? So some of the reasons why you want to have a plan in place for media communications are, if you're experiencing an ongoing security event or an ongoing incident, right? That is a place where you can provide regular updates to, and you don't have to take on the regular update to a wider audience if you have that additional help. The other thing that is very important is making sure that that channel has accurate information. So if there are rumors involved, you can dispel some of those rumors, or just getting the good, transparent view of what's happening accurately at the moment can help the rest of the community feel more confident that they know what's going on.
Sharon, quick question there.
Sure.
So obviously good advice to contact the media when you do have an incident, but are you suggesting, like, if it's a ransomware attack, that before you have maybe details, are you suggesting contacting the media right away for awareness for other groups, or is it better to get some details first, or, and after you contact the media, how do you kind of influence how they report it, or do you have the ability to influence that?
Yeah, you do. And we'll talk about the influencing part in a minute. But it's always a bit of a tricky situation, right? You don't necessarily want to just immediately jump on the phone if you don't have any information, right? Telling people that you have some huge thing going on is okay. But it's better if you say, hey, we've detected something, we think perhaps this. Don't give false information, obviously. But you also don't want to wait until it's all done and go, oh, by the way, like a month ago, we had this huge thing, because information will get out, whether you have anything to do with it or not. And people may be calling you, right? So one of the things, just from a media communications perspective, is have your team trained. If they are out on a break and walk outside, if somebody just sidles up to us and say, hey, what's going on? I heard there was a huge thing going on. You don't know if that's a reporter looking for a story because they've heard a rumor. So it's a bit of a balance, is the end result there. So sometimes it's get people updated quickly and tell them you'll get them more information as soon as you can, and then follow through on that. So there's ransomware is a great example, because there may be some very obvious public effects from ransomware. If you have, say, a major financial institution who has got a ransomware and their website is down, people know that already.
Right.
So giving information in that regard may be helpful. If you can consider some of these questions here as part of your planning for that process. You can maybe get ahead of some of it, right? By giving some information on urgency and severity from what you know right now. And I think a lot of those messages should be very clear. This is what I know now. That may change as we move forward with rectifying what's going on. If you can figure out or kind of think through, how do people react to this kind of thing? How do you think they will react, and try to address some of that up front? That's also helpful as well. Okay, that's a good question. Thank you. This last bullet here is interesting as well. If you do talk to the media and you want to get information out, that's great. Are you prepared to handle an influx of queries? Right? If you've said, hey, we're the organization handling this thing, your number is probably published, your email addresses, your social media are probably published out there. We're a very connected world. So do you have the capability of handling that set of inquiries coming back? So that's also just something else to think through when you're thinking about planning, and maybe try to address in any public communication that you have. So I talked about mechanisms. So here are some of the mechanisms. And again, it will depend on urgency and severity of the information. So if you need to get things out quickly, maybe an email is not the best bet, right? If you need kind of a who needs to know, if you have a very cold, specific list of people that you need to have this information right now, and you can maybe communicate it to a wider audience later, that may not be like a social media kind of thing, right? So each one of these mechanisms has a purpose. And when you're defining your communication plan, a lot of those things, and there's some listed here, will be the mechanism is kind of driven by the kind of communication you would like to put out. So just a white paper, maybe a publication, that kind of thing would be good for some longer term kind of communication, not in the midst of an incident. Alerts and warnings, usually more effective from a text message, email perspective, if that's a small audience that you need to get to help with things. So that kind of thing is what you learn over time. And also you can do your best up front if you don't have a communications plan yet to ballpark it and say, well, we think this makes sense. And then as you're testing, as you've experienced a few occurrences, you can refine that as needed. Okay. The last bullet here is one of the important ones. How does your audience that you're trying to communicate with, how do they typically get information, or how do they consume information? Do they read news stories that are published on a web page somewhere? Do they really use social media more than anything else, right? So some of those things come into play as well. Okay, so now we talked about some of those mechanisms and how do we try to plan for communications. Let's talk about responsibilities, especially for crisis management. So the important part here is, like everything, right? You have to define what crisis means for you. It might mean, let's say I was working for one of the states in the U.S. At a technology organization as part of the state government. A crisis for me might mean that one huge agency has been removed from the internet, or their systems are down at some percentage, right? That might be a crisis. That may or may not be a crisis for somebody else. So that kind of thing, what does that mean? Many people already have experience with defining that because they've done business continuity planning or some kind of disaster recovery planning. So it's very similar to that exercise. But figuring out what a crisis means to you is important. That way you know when to pull that trigger to say, we're in a crisis now, and maybe we pull more people in from a different team to help with it, or there's all kinds of trigger, things that could happen. But figuring out what's a regular, and this sounds weird when I say it, but a regular incident versus a crisis situation, right? So these are some of the things that incident management teams, from a best practice perspective, can do in a crisis, right? Maybe put their points of contact for their communications team, if you have one, out a little farther, in the know or in the media, so people have a place to call in. If you think of a crisis incident, you think there's going to be pretty widespread, even if it's a private company, right? It's going to be, for your customer base, it might be a widespread effect. Helping distribute information more timely or more frequently to your constituents might be something that is triggered by a crisis situation. Okay. Any kind of reporting or decision making, all of that, comes under a microscope and has a lot of pressure associated with it. So trying to think through that at a time when you're not in a crisis is very helpful. So when you get in a crisis, you say, no, we have a plan. Let's take a look at the plan. So some of the crisis communication, procedures to look at: pre-planning. So when you're making your plans, have some standard plans, procedures to follow when your crisis activities occur. And the tricky part there is sticking to them, at least until you can't anymore, right? When you have a crisis, so now you're in the midst of it, identify one person to be the lead for the priority stuff. Communicate any priority instructions. So stop what you're doing on that other thing that you're working on. Here's your priority right now. One of the things that people have found much success in is maybe being able to pull some people from a different team in these situations to say, hey, I need you to help answer the phones while we're working on a priority situation, and train them ahead of time and give them some scripts to be able to do that. And then some initial resources. If you have a packet of just some initial FAQs or just, things you've been asked before and that you've answered already, you know what that looks like. Or if you haven't, then you'll learn. But for anybody that calls, they say, here's what we're allowed to share right now. That includes, reporting or any list of, specific things that you want to make sure that the media knows. And the media is going to want to know things like the who, what, when, where, right? Who is it affecting? When did this happen? Or when do you think it might be fixed? What is the scope? What's the impact for people? How did this happen? It will use your ransomware example there and say, it was a ransomware attack, and we think and you can say we think, you don't have to attribute it necessarily, but we think it came in this fashion, right? Right now, these are the impacted areas of service, and we're not entirely sure yet, but we'll give you more information when it's going to be, contained and or, when we recover from that, something like that. And now the important part. Did you have any other questions that you wanted to throw out before I talk about resources?
Just one other one, kind of an obvious one, but I think it's something important to address. Is so you're in the midst of a critical incident. The team is obviously very busy. Is it really the best time to stop and think about who else to communicate with this? And who are those others that you're asking to communicate to?
Gotcha. So if you don't have a communications plan and you are in the midst of a critical situation, it is not the best time to stop and think about that. But I will say that it may be the most important time. So it kind of depends on your skill set, right? When I was, earlier in my career, a security person, right, I worked a lot of security incidents, and I'm in the midst of log files and firewall logs and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I couldn't pull my head out of the log file situation as I'm trying to figure it out to talk to any other human. So having that ahead of time and having somebody identified as this is the person who's going to do it. And then if you can, have them, trained a little bit, or even better, have a media communications person or public relations person on staff or on some kind of retainer that you can bring in for that situation, so that the people who are knee deep in technical situation don't have to try and extract their brain from that to try and communicate. But there needs to be some kind of, I'm going to call it a translator role, which I've also played a lot in my life, which is I can understand what the technical people are saying and then communicate that to people who don't speak tech. And that is also an important skill set, important quality to have. So if you can have that person be the person to say, okay, I understand what they're doing, and let me tell you in layman's terms, what's going on. But in the middle of a critical event, when you don't have any planning, it's awful. So do yourself a favor and plan
Yeah,
some of
no,
that.
I think that's such great advice because, to your point, like it's not a matter of, if this is going to happen, it's when. So I think
Absolutely.
really great advice.
Great. Thank you. All right. So let's talk about the resources. I mentioned we have a lot of them. This first one is the SEI Guide to Effective Management Communication, Incident Management Communications. It looks like this. When you see it, it's a booklet. It's not very long. It's about 12 pages of content, things we talked about in this presentation already. There are quite a number of checklists. And when I talk about the kinds of communications you might want to create, right, we have a whole list of here are the things you want to think about. Do you need this one? Do you need this one? Do you need this one? So it's a really good list to make sure you've got the breadth of coverage there. It's also got a truckload of links and other places to get more information. So it's really a solid resource. If you're new to this idea, or if you've been doing it for a while, but you're not entirely comfortable that you've got everything covered, it's a really solid resource to look for. These next two are part of the source material that we use to build this and that we've looked at and had some input into to help the general public. NIST is a U.S. organization that puts out a lot of standards and processes and that kind of thing. This is a link to their paper about improving critical infrastructure security. It's a framework for that. And then the first CSIRT Services Framework is also a solid resource. FIRST stands for the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams. It is an international organization that has 700 plus members, and they are all incident response security operations teams. So this is their framework for how you build services around incident response. Communication is featured in many of those services. Coordinating an incident, managing an incident, all of those kinds of things, especially in the recovery process, getting back to good. And then the other NIST publication here is just a planning guide put out by NIST for how to deal with contingencies, right? Something goes wrong. How do you communicate? How do you recover from that kind of thing? These are some solid resources there, but the big list is in the paper itself. So I would recommend that folks go and download that paper, take a look at it. It's definitely will give you something that you didn't already know, I guarantee you. Good.
Yeah, Sharon, thank you so much for the discussion today.
Sure.
Especially, I know we were planning on doing this live. We appreciate your patience and getting this recording out as soon as possible. But we really appreciate you spending a little extra time and sharing your expertise today. So thanks again.
I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
And lastly, we'd like to thank you all for watching today's webcast. Upon exiting, please hit the like button below the video window and share the archive if you found value. Also, you can subscribe to the SEI's YouTube channel by clicking on the SEI seal in the lower right corner of the video window. Our next webcast will be March 13th. The topic will be, can a cybersecurity parametric cost model be developed, by Christopher Miller. Registration information is available on our website now and will be emailed out as well. Any questions from today's event, please email info@sei.cmu.edu. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.